really, to begin the conversation, I'd like, I think, Sammy and Ruth to address the question of how we can, as concerned academics, best analyse Israeli democracy in its current form. So perhaps Sammy, if you'd like to start.
Thank you very much, Alan. I would like to thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to share some ideas with the members of this association. I think the way to get a real sense about Israeli democracy is to compare it with Western democracies. Because Israel sees itself and seen internationally as part of the family of Western countries. When I say Western countries, I mean Western Europe and the countries that were established by Western Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand. And Israel sees itself as part of this world, and it compares itself to this world. And this is what I do in my work, looking at Israeli democracy from a Western perspective.
Well, we start to disagree. I think that we do need a baseline from which we can discuss Israeli democracy. I think democracy is a concept that is extremely controversial in the world today. There is a sense, I think, in some at least of the West, that there is a crisis in Western democracy. And I would like to take the position that we need an ideal type of democracy. It's not an all or nothing, it's a more or less concept. And to understand the processes of democracy and the challenges of democracy, I think we need a more flexible conceptual framework. And I suggest a very minimalistic, procedural, conceptual framework that says that democracy is the kind of political regime that is built on the idea that decision-making are made by the demos of that particular country, demos meaning all the people who are citizens of the state and only them, and the principle is self-determination of that particular demos, the political community, on the basis of equality, one person, one vote, and freedom to exercise the right to choose one rulers. Now this is, to me, democracy, and all the rest is additional. Now in Israel, it has all the general problems of democracy. It has a particular problem because it's defined as a Jewish democracy. The Jewishness of the Israeli democracy goes on two distinct but related fault lines. One is the ethnic, the other is the religious. So there is an argument between Jews and non-Jews ethnic. There is an argument between Jews about what is the Judaism of the state, like Christian, Muslim, or like national Hungarian, French. And among the non-Jews in Israel, there is also this tension between religion and non-religion. So we're talking about ethnic versus neutral state and theocracy versus democracy. These are the tensions that I think we should speak about when we talk about Israeli democracy and its challenges.
So are we talking here about a formal democracy, or are we talking about content? And if we're talking about content, isn't there some sort of basic level that we should be looking for? I mean, we have expectations. It's not a matter of just saying, okay, we've got the demos voting, so everything's okay. So to what extent do we actually fill this void with some sort of values and content? And if we're talking about values and content, where are they coming from?
Okay, what Ruth said, I accept, I agree, that's not problematic at all. Israel is a democracy rather than non-democracy because it is procedural democracy. It's a procedural, and of course, this is the basis of any democracy. Without procedural democracy, we cannot talk about democracy. But my conception is of much higher level. And the higher level is Western democracy. And what we mean by Western democracy is substantive democracy, not procedural democracy. Substantive democracy is about a set of values, not a set of procedures and institutions. That's for sure. That's without this, we cannot talk about democracy. We're talking about set of values, absolute values. And first of these values is equality of people. But not only equality, freedom, justice, fairness, compassion, all these absolute values we judge democracy, and the best model we have today still, the Western democracy. And I said, one reason, not only because it's a higher quality democracy, but also because Israel sees itself as part of the West. Now, let me tell you my position about this issue. Israel is not Western democracy. Israel is not Western society in all pretensions. And Israel cannot be, not only it's not, but cannot be. And I explained why it cannot be. And not for one reason, for many reasons. At least 5 reasons there are today that Israel cannot be a first-hand, first-rate democracy. Israel is second-rate democracy. Not only because it's an ethnic democracy, but for other reasons. We have to have a macro view of Israeli political system. And the Israeli political system reflects the general context in which it is located. And we have to talk about the general context.
Well, we are sitting in a place that is not part of the Western world simply stated. I don't think that we want to say that only Western democracy is first-rate democracy. I do not want a conception of democracy that excludes India from the democratic family of nations. And this is for a reason. I think that a narrower conception of democracy is better because it includes more countries in the democratic family of nations and allows more dynamicism between conceptions of democracy. Now, democracy is a system of government for people of different persuasions. The values that I share with my colleague, justice, freedom, equality, are just values that A, are not universal in a rich sense, and secondly, their interpretation is very, very limited. I want to draw a distinction between some such values, call them human rights, which I will say are universal values, and democracy. Democracy is the system of government of particular demoses. If we are going to define a first-rate democracy by its obedience to a set of universal values, we are undervaluing self-determination in favor of universal values. I reject that. I think the principle of democracy is a principle for different kinds of social, cultural, political communities. Now, I would tend to agree that Israel has some very, very interesting challenges to democracy. But I don't think that this means that it's not a free-trade democracy. One other point. Yes, procedure is not enough. I don't want you to think that what I'm saying is that democracy is exhausted by a general election. It is not. There's some aspects of social life that are critical to democracy. And this is the understanding, the shared understanding, that rulers are identified by elections that are free and equal, and that means quite a lot in terms of the structure of social institutions in society. Without that, you don't have democracy. without having a basic commitment to human dignity and to the idea that the people of this country share a commitment to the thriving of their society and therefore are willing to negotiate their differences and not use force in order to change the government, this also dictates quite a lot of content for democracy. So it's not only elections, it's elections plus, but the question of the plus is primarily dictated by the demos of the particular country.
Okay, so if I can just challenge you on that for the moment. You've got the framework, you've got the negotiation, right? Is Israel negotiating the rights between its minority and its majority in the way that you wanted to under the sort of democracy that you would expect in your country?
Here I think I have to draw a distinction between my view as a scholar and my view as a citizen. And this is part of my idea of democracy. My idea of democracy is that democracy is the shared political framework of my society. I happen to come from a certain ideology and from a certain socio-economic group and a certain ethnic group, and I have an ideology that is mine, and I would like to use democracy in order to make sure that as much of my ideology is incorporated and implemented in my country. So when I look at Israel today, I am concerned. When I look as a scholar, I see the changes in demography and in geopolitical circumstances and in ideology, and I'm worried that my ideological camp is using the language of democracy in a way that inhibits them from really analyzing democracy and from doing what it takes to influence the outcome of life in my country. So as a scholar, I am afraid that a tendency to misconceptualize democracy by my ideological camp confuses the understanding of what is happening in Israel and the necessary political implications.
I really don't understand you because it's hard to understand. But let me tell you something much more specific. There are 5 structural impediments for a high-quality Western democracy in Israel. And this is, I think, what's the real problem. First, Israel is a deeply divided society between Arabs and Jews. I'm talking about Arabs and Jews who are citizens of the state within the 367 border, and deeply divided societies, as we know, from Yugoslavia, from Northern Ireland before 1998, and many other deeply divided societies. There is always a temptation that a majority becomes the tyranny, the majority rule becomes a tyranny of the majority. And that is something which is inherent in deeply divided societies. So Israel is a deeply society, so there is a tendency for the Jewish majority to misuse its power against non-Jews, and also against others. That's one thing. The other thing is the Israeli-Arab conflict or the Palestinian question. And I don't know how many of you are aware. Israel declared a status of emergency in 1948 and is still in effect. So we have been living for 70 years under a state of emergency. How can you have a high-quality democracy when you live in a state of emergency which provides the authorities, and especially the military authorities, with enormous power? And you can say it's on paper. It's not real, but it's real. And I can go into detail to show you that it's real. Now, this Israeli-Arab conflict also creates a minority in Israel 20% of the population, which is part of an active enemy. The Palestinians are active enemy of Israel or of the Jews, and this minority is part of it. Now, how can you then provide equal rights and treat equally a minority who is part of an active enemy? And how do you expect this minority to fully identify with the state when it is considered the state also, which is the enemy of its own people? That's another. Now, when you have such a state of emergency, you cannot provide freedoms and equal rights and all this stuff, because you have to have restrictions on democratic rights. Now, the third element, the third obstacle for Israeli democracy is the place of religion in Israeli society. You know, religion in Israel is central in life, because the state assigns every person in the state to one religion. And to acquire your rights of marriage and divorce and other things, you do it through religion. Now, a religion is not, there is no equality in religion between men and women, between Jews and non-Jews, and so forth. So, and religion, the state of religion in Israel creates religious coercion in many areas of life. Now, when you have religious coercion, you cannot talk about high-quality democracy. I mean, it's very difficult to do. You don't have the right to marriage in Israel. It's restricted because you marry, you don't have a civil marriage and divorce. Now let me go into the fourth element. What is the fourth element? Israel is a Jewish and Zionist state. If it is Jewish and Zionist state, and Israel has the right to be a national state of the Jews, so don't misunderstand. I am a Zionist, not only I support Israel as a Jewish state. But we have to understand what it means. It means that you exclude, that you cannot have equality in the state. So this means that the Jews are privileged in one way or another. Otherwise, you have no meaning to the idea of a Jewish state. A Jewish state has to provide some privilege to the Jews. And Israel does provide privileges to the Jews. Israel is defined as the homeland of the Jewish people. So if you are not a Jew, so it doesn't belong to you. The Jews own the state. This is what I said. Now let me just explain what Zionism means in this context. Zionism dictates to the state that its central role as a state is to keep Israel Jewish forever. That's the meaning of Israeli Zionism. So there is no in democracy, the idea of democracy, that you can associate, you can build political parties, you can do a lot of things in order to create a new majority, right? That's the whole idea. And then you can rule for at least 4 years and so on. In Israel, you cannot do it. Because there are all kinds of laws, for example, the law of a political party. You cannot establish a political party which denies Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people. So you cannot create a new majority which changes the character of the state. So what I am saying, this is then cannot provide any space for the creation of a full democracy. And the last thing, which is contextual, but it's very important. We have now an era in which the political right wing is dominant for the last at least 40 years. This is a new context. And the right wing has a mission to redesign Israeli society according to its own outlooks. And I can expand on this to show why they are doing it and why they are doing it more in the last, say, 7 or 8 years, much more as a project, not just as an idea. Now, the right wing, compared to the left wing, I'm talking about generally, is for Israel to be more Jewish than democratic. not to have a balance between Jewishness and democracy. So Israel then is shifting toward less democracy and more Jewishness and more Zionism and more restrictions on freedoms and equality. And last thing, a minute. You know, Israel has many laws. There's also basic laws. There is no law of equality. There are some laws of equality only in a specific, like equality in the workplace or this kind of things, but not as a basic principle of equality. And this is the kind of democracy we have.
Okay, I think it's very brave to challenge Ruth on the legal basis of the Constitution, but also I'd like to remind the audience that Ruth also wrote a report for the previous government on the whole issue of Jewish and democratic and the legislating that sort of relationship. So, I'm wondering whether you've got anything to say in response to this.
I'm speechless.
No, you're not.
I'm speechless.
Never been.
I think Sammy now permits me to show by his statement what I meant earlier by saying that the left, which I still think we both belong to ideologically, is misusing democracy when they are talking about their political situation. Yes, we now do have a situation in Israel in which the right wing has been growing in political influence. Not only it's the right wing, which right-left now is very complicated in Israel and in many other places because you don't know if it's political, economic, or Palestinian, or big government, small government. The whole thing is very, very complicated. Let's talk about the right, okay? So the right is now in power. The right, in part, is in power because of numbers. As I said, democracy is, after all, a question of numbers. We all agreed that it's not only elections, but it is elections. Now, if a political power that used to be the majority in their society realizes that because of slow demographic processes, it is becoming the minority. Some people say, well, that's now, we used to be a majority, we were trying to protect the rights of minorities, now we're going to invoke the same norms of rights of minorities that we protected, and we are going to enjoy life as a minority, and that's the name of the democratic game. But sometimes you say, no, this is terrible. They are, taking our country away from us. They are bad. They are anti-democratic. Democracy means that what they want to do is unconstitutional and unacceptable. Now, the more you do that, the more you are undercutting the basic principle of democracy that respects the wishes of the people who actually live in the country. And if you constantly want to change the people, when the people all of a sudden don't talk your language, then I think that maybe you're right, because I also like your ideals better, but I don't think that your commitment is to democracy. It's a commitment to something else. It's a commitment to the philosopher king. It's a commitment to the right, not to the procedure that is supposed to be the inclusive procedure that legitimates political power. So now, the reality in Israel is, I think, much more complex than the one presented by Israel, and I think that Sammy himself says, I'm a Zionist, and I think Israel can and should be a Jewish state. But then he says, what does Jewish state mean? It means necessarily discrimination. This cannot be a democracy. So my argument is different. I'm also a Zionist. I want Israel to be a Jewish and democratic state. And when the international community said that there should be in Palestine a Jewish and an Arab state, not a Muslim state, a Jewish and an Arab state, the idea was there that these two peoples cannot govern in the same state, and they need each to have self-determination in their own states to control defense, immigration, settlement, etc. That's what the United Nations said. So the United Nations didn't say Israel should be a neutral, liberal party privatizing everything. It said Israel should be the national home, the self-determination location for Jews, and therefore it should be allowed to discriminate for Jews in terms of immigration. But it shouldn't be allowed, and the United Nations demanded that, to discriminate against non-Jews in Israel. And Israel is committed to that. It doesn't always implement that, but to that it is committed. I don't want to go into the details of how terrible the situation in Israel is. I just want to say that the Palestinian conflict obviously goes both ways. If we're talking about the Arab minority in Israel as just a minority, then they should be integrated and given full equality, They don't want to be privatized. They don't want to be treated as only individuals. They want to be treated as Arab, Muslim, Christian individuals, and they should be allowed to do that. Multiculturalism, everything is fine. The conflict is creating complications in both directions. It does make it harder for the Arab minority to integrate into Israel. It does make it harder for the Jewish majority to give Arabs full equal rights, because they are considered, yes, a group with, problematic allegiances. And they are. And it's something that we should accept. And I think that Israeli democracy is trying to negotiate between Israeli Arabs as citizens and Israeli Arabs as potentially Palestinians in ways that are not always optimal, but I think are decent, credible. Definitely is not something that means that credentials of democracy are gone. One thing about religion. I do not think that democracy, even in the Western model, is necessarily a secular state. And if we impose on the idea of democracy secularism, then we are running into deep trouble in societies, not only Israel, in which a majority of the people not only are deeply religious, because in America they also are deeply religious, but are willing to have separation of state and church. So we need to discuss between the state and the... Now, it's true that Israel inherited from the Ottoman Empire the principle of the millet system, the idea that all matters of personal status, marriage and divorce, are controlled by the monopoly over the religious establishment of the religious community. This is bad. This is problematic. The Jewish minority in Israel in the mandatory period wanted to get rid of that, but the Arab majority didn't want to, and the mandatory authorities. Israel perpetuated that. I think it was a terrible mistake. But the reality of life in Israel, as the reality of free countries with that kind of inheritance, is totally different. I don't think in Israel today there is any problem for a person to live and get recognized with the person of their choice, be there of another religion or of the same sex or whatever. I think in this sense Israel is one of the most free and accepting and inclusive countries in the world. And we have to draw the distinction between the laws on the books, which are bad, concede that, and the reality, the social reality on the ground, in which I think Israel can compete very, very well with every Western democracy. So the picture is much more complex, and we shouldn't enlist the idea of democracy to deal with these issues. Do we negotiate well? Not always. Is there an alternative way of negotiating? I don't think there is a more democratic way of negotiating these than the way that it's being done in Israel at the moment.
So, the way we're proceeding now is that Sammy has got one or two things to say in response to that. And then we're going to have space for question and answer and statements from the floor. So, if you can keep it relatively brief, Sammy, then to allow time for other people.
My message is very clear. There is a situation in Israel that cannot let Israel to be a high-quality democracy, or a Western democracy. It creates conflicts and situations which does not allow. If you have a continued Israeli-Arab conflict, so you have a problem. I mean, you cannot have a full-fledged democracy. You have to restrict freedoms of people. If you declare it as Jewish state, a Zionist state, you cannot give equality to Arabs. You cannot. Now, I'm not saying that since I am for a Jewish state and then I'm a Zionist, I'm not saying Israel is not a democracy. I'm saying Israel is a diminished democracy. Israel is a low-grade democracy and cannot be otherwise. Cannot be otherwise. Unless it will change, for example, separate between religion and state, or end the Israeli-Arab conflict, then find the dominance of the right wing will not be that the way that it is, and so forth. So you have to change the system. I'm saying that there is no tension between Jewishness and democracy. There are inherent contradictions, not tensions. Inherent contradictions which reduce democracy. And now the trend over the years was to democratize Israel since the mid-60s of the last century. Before the mid-60s, Israel was quasi-democracy. It was not real democracy. But from the mid-60s of the last century till 1909, with the new Netanyahu term and the right-wing government, there is a process of de-democratization. And this is the right wing in Israel has a project of de-democratization of Israel, and there are many indications in this area.
Marco, are you hand up? We can just wait for the mic.
I want to ask Sammy just one question. If the right wing is de-democratizing Israel, it's not just pushing its own political agenda, which is bad. If it's de-democratizing, what do you think Israel can and should be to remain as good a democracy as it can be according to your analysis? What do you think we should do?
How do we should act, you mean, as citizens or what?
Revolution? Change the results of the elections? Stop the right wing from winning? What should we do to be democracy?
Okay, listen, I think it's, since it is procedural democracy and it's not substantive democracy, that's really the distinction. Then the right wing can implement its policies and making all kinds of changes.
I totally disagree, because democracy is checks and balances. And there are checks and there are balances, and they're acting in Israel and in many other places. It's not as if winners take all. Israeli democracy and no democracy is a winners take all democracy.
I want to say this, but you say it.
Okay.
But there are things that you cannot do or you should not do. You should not declare the opposition as an enemy. You should not incite against one group against the other. You don't have to have a Nakba law. You know what's a Nakba law? Or what the boycott law. I mean, I don't have the right in Israel to support a boycott of the Jewish settlements in the West Bank. It's against the Israeli law. So this kind of things that if you really have any respect to even minimal democracy, You shouldn't do. Now what I'm saying, the right wing in the last 7-8 years, they are stepping out of limits, of minimal limits of democracy. And why they are doing it? Because, two things, because the contradictions between occupation and democracy becoming more and more blatant and on the surface and internationally censored. And because the contradictions between democracy and Jewishness and Zionism are also becoming more and more blatant because the Arab minorities struggle in Israel for equal rights and for equality and so forth. The contradictions in Israel, and also because the contradictions between freedom and democracy and coercion and religious coercion is also becoming more and more blatant. All these contradictions, the right wing in Israel, the right wing government in Israel are trying to subjugate, to subdue all kinds of policies.
The solution for Israeli democracy is to get the right wing out of power. And if we can't do it in elections, we'll have to find some other way.
No, to let them behave correctly, not
how.
The problem is that their orientation, the democratic core of the right wing in Israel, has been broken. That's the problem.
Okay, I think we might have a moment for a question. Quick.
Okay, I apologize because I came in a bit later after the start.
Well, we're not going to start again, so...
Yeah. But in case the problem was not solved before, I think that we have an elephant in the room because, well, I think that Ruth mentioned the people that actually live in the country, okay, as a sort of the subject of the democracy. Okay, but which country are we talking about? Because I remember, for example, a very instructive debate that developed between Israel Studies and Israel Affairs, or something like this, like 20 years ago, about the subject of ethnic democracy. Sammy Smooha, Ruth Gavison, etc., etc. And the supporter of the idea of Jewish democracy basically said something like this: maybe it's not the best democracy ever, but it is a democracy. Of course, provided that we can solve the issue of the territories. Okay, because there we have the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza. They don't have citizenship. They don't vote in the general elections, etc., etc. That was, I think, in 1997. And Israel conquered the territories in 1967. So I think that half of the people in the room were not there before that year. And so what we know now is Israel plus the territories. Okay. And so I find all those debates about, you know, if it's a low-grade democracy or a full democracy or a Western democracy or can aspire to be a little, you know, into thin air because we're not considering what is the real issue. So in the last 50 years, Israel has ruled over the West Bank and Gaza, and there's no doubt whatsoever that they're not part of any democratic model, any model of citizenship, etc., etc. So discussing the idea of good old times that at some point, at this point at least, were almost never there. It's like discussing the constitutional arrangement of the Solomon and deciding whether what is our opinion of Israel based on those facts, which I think is implausible.
Okay, and rather than collect more questions at the moment, I think this is a very important point that I think our panelists should respond to at this stage before we move on. So Ruth, perhaps if you'd like to go first.
I totally agree that the reality of Israel now requires an analysis of the continued occupation. I don't think there is any question that Israel and the territories combined, if they are seen as one territorial and political community and not a democracy. Because clearly a large part of the population living in those places, I don't count Gaza in, but the West Bank, don't have civil and political rights. This is under the simplest procedural criterion of democracy, non-democratic. So the issue for Israel is this really a temporary situation, or is this something that is there to stay? And if it is there to stay, you're quite right, this debate is not relevant. But Professor Smooha has for years, and I agree, thought that it's worthwhile talking about Israeli democracy even without the territories. And the reason that it's so important are the reasons that we are debating, which are very important for Israel. And this is the way Israel is managing its internal conflicts with the Arab minority and the religious secular tension and all these questions. These questions are critical because ultimately the ability of the State of Israel to decide politically about the future of the territories depends on the robustness of the shared legitimacy of its institutions. And what we are seeing now is a delegitimation of the democratic nature of the state from within, which means that it's going to be almost impossible without polarizing Israel to decide this grave political question about the future of the territories. And this is in part why I am so insistent that we agree that, yes, there are things that are constitutionally impossible to do, but not every specific law that you dislike, and not every particular move that I dislike are immediately reasons to think that the right wing has lost its democratic credentials. Because the left wing, when it was in power for 50 years until 1977, 20 pre-state and 30 post-states, did not treat the revisionist right-wing religious minority of the Jewish community in Israel any better than the right wing today is treating the present left wing, which is still overrepresented, represented in the legal, the economical, the cultural, the university. So this is an ongoing struggle. It's a very serious struggle, and for this struggle to be conducted as it should be, you're right. No one should incite against another group. But the rhetoric of some of the leftists against some of the religious settlers and the rightists is as unpleasant as the rhetoric of some of the right wing against the left wing. So there is a danger there. The danger is mutual, and we should all, members of the community in Israel, Jews and Arabs, agree to some constitutional red lines that are not going to be broken, in order that we can indeed get rid of this problem, which is threatening the future of Israel, not only as a Jewish and democratic state, as Jewish, as democratic, and maybe as a state.
Okay, two comments. One comment is there is a difference between, say, the left, say, in the 50s or 60s, in a quasi-democracy, at that time, and then after, say, 50 years, when Israel became much more democratized, and then you go back and you use the same tactics of the 50s and 60s. So it's not symmetrical. So now the retrograde, the regression, is much more serious than before, because we built a better democracy. Before we didn't have a real democracy. Now we have a democracy, and now they are going and weakening. Now about the West Bank. Listen, I mean, if there is no green line, then the whole discussion about democracy, there is no democracy. You know, when you have 2.5 million people stateless without any political rights. So, and it's worse than that, because not only it's 50 years of occupation, but the government do not have a vision how to end it. So you don't give hope that you are going to change it. So it's the situation is much worse. You know? And you have the international community, of course, against it. You know? I mean, that's what I'm saying. But I am much more optimistic than all of you. I think the Green Line is still in existence. It's in existence in many ways, and it's much easier to withdraw from the West Bank than many of people think that it is possible. That's from sociological point of view, not because I have a wishful thinking because of that. The West Bank people, the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are not part of Israel. They don't see themselves as part. Israelis, Jewish and Arab, do not see them as part of Israel. They are not part of the Israeli institutions. They are not part of the Israeli culture and so forth. They are under occupation. The Arabs in Israel, they are not under occupation. They are citizens. Whatever discrimination are against them and exclusion and so forth, still they are citizens with rights. They are not equal citizens, but they are citizens. So I think the Green Line is still there. Many people thought that when Israel will draw from Gaza, there will be a kind of, I think Israel, I have real belief in Israeli democracy. Israeli democracy is it's a second-rate democracy, but it's a resilient democracy. It's a stable democracy. With all these problems we have over the years for 70 years, Israeli democracy did not collapse. It persisted. So we have, this is two features of Israeli democracy. On one hand, it is persistent and it is stable. On the other hand, it's of low quality. We have to live with this. That's the way it is. Now, so this is what I tell you. So I talk about Israeli democracy within the Green Line because I believe there is a Green Line.
There was a question from that.
Yeah, well, since I don't share this preoccupation with the occupation, and I also don't think that democracy is the limit. When I lose elections, I have a different question altogether. And that is, I'm really worried about Israeli democracy, but not, I'm talking about the separation of powers, about activist courts, about the situation. I would like to hear what you think about it. The situation, the way I see it, is well, legal bureaucracy, unelected legal bureaucracy, makes decisions which actually overrule the politicians, the politicians are very little to say in Israel. So, Ruth, actually talking to you, it seems to me that this procedural idea of democracy doesn't exist anymore in Israel, because elections do not matter. Because there is a bureaucracy that makes decisions without any way that they should answer to the public, to the elected. Thank you.
Okay. With regard to that question, I think we should bear in mind that the next plenary session is going to be a discussion of the role and the cause of the democracy, and if you want to deal with it in a brief way at this stage, that's also fine.
I don't. I think we'll have time to do it, but I think this is part of the problem. We use too much hyperbole in descriptions of processes, and this is not good for thinking about democracy. I'm a bit more pessimistic than Sammy about the ability of Israel to withdraw from the territories, but I'm very, very pleased to hear what he has to say about democracy. And I think when we really talk about this, maybe our differences are not as big as they seem when we are kind of angry at each other. Because I think that Israeli democracy is indeed very resilient. It is all we have, and it's an asset, and we should work on it. Now, the thing about the courts is also movements of pendulums. This happens in all democracies. You know, America survived McCarthy. It survived a civil war that was quite terrible. It probably will survive Trump. We all hope it will. And hopefully. And this happens. I mean, there are all kinds of things happening in democracies. Now, I think there was a period in time in which many people felt in Israel that the courts were becoming too powerful. It was never as if this was ruled by the courts. It is definitely not like that now, but there is this rhetoric. We should look at the reality in a complex and dynamic way. Yes, there are checks and balances. There are, we'll talk about this tomorrow, but it's not the case that everything is broken, this is tyranny, and now when you say tyranny, then you say we need to rebel, because when there is tyranny, you don't do elections, you do something else. We should be very careful with our texts, with our rhetoric. If the rhetoric is more low-key, then we can think about democratically dealing with the issues. Now, if we only can be second-rate democracy, this is fine. I'm willing to be a second-rate democracy. But I'm also interested in defending my democracy against the kind of rhetoric from all sides that will undermine the checks and balances that are required to guarantee that nothing is final. Nothing is final. Everything is always tentative. It's a beginning to a new negotiation from a position of strength, equality, freedom, and a shared agreement that we don't kill our prime ministers and we don't go out to the square to oust them.
There is a... we take that one up there first, okay.
This is a question to Sammy. I basically agree with most of what you said and analyzed, but I have a certain problem when you insist that Israel is a Jewish state, thus Zionist, thus necessary to have privileges to the Jews. This was not said by the UN, this was not said by the Declaration of Independence. The only privileges that was done was liberty of immigration, none other. And this obviously is not written in the texts, and unfortunately it was implemented time and again.
So we have here the possibility of a Jewish democracy based on majority only.
Yes, you are right. I mean, of course, Israel. It's not the right and the acceptance of Israel or legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state. And there is international legitimacy. Israel is a Jewish state. It's not a legitimacy to discriminate and to exclude and to do all kinds of things, of course. So we have to fight in Israel for a better Zionism, for more modernism. I think, now let me just make a distinction. I make a real distinction between a Jewish state and a Zionist state. A Jewish state is a state with a Jewish majority. A Jewish state with the Jewish symbols. And all this kind of features of Jewish language and language, culture and so forth. Zionism is something else. Zionism is an ideology that Israel should remain Jewish forever. That the central role of the state is to stay as a Jew, as Jewish, and to promote Jewishness and to become more Jewish and all this stuff. That's the question is if you need that the state has some role to do it, but for how much? Are there any limits? And that's what I'm saying, the change that we have in the last 7 years or so. They are losing, the right wing is losing the awareness of limits. That's why we're talking about negotiation and all this stuff. They want now to legislate a nation-state law, which Ruth is against it, right? You are against it. And what they are going to do, they are going to state that democracy is subjected to the Jewishness of the state when you have a contradiction. So they are going to formalize ethnic democracy in the worst situation, in the worst stage. That's what do they need this? Why they are doing it? because
I thank Sammy because this is exactly what I'm going to tell the chairman of the Knesset next week when I try to persuade him not to legislate this law. I will tell him, Sammy said in an international convention that this means that Israel is becoming much more Jewish than it is a democracy. I think it's a bad law. I think it's a superfluous law. It's not a needed law. It's a terrible sign of weakness. But if this law is enacted, and there is a possibility that it will be enacted, I will not say that this is the end of democracy. This is stupid. This is really bad. This is terrible. I told them, I will fight against them. But I don't think that this means that the right lost its sense of democracy. I don't think that is a right way of describing it. And I must say I don't understand why you stick to this kind of description. We can say that democracy is not the only good thing on earth. There are equality and dignity and other things. I want to say something about the Zionist thing because I think it's very important. I don't think that anything that is happening now is about more Jewish or more democratic. I think that it's a part of the constant negotiation between the two. But there is one thing that I think is critical, and this is the continued commitment of the State of Israel, which is indeed discriminatory in nature to some extent, of maintaining a Jewish majority. Maintaining a Jewish majority obviously involves not annexing the territory, but maintaining a Jewish majority does have implications to all kinds of things. And I don't know if we have an ideological debate here, because I do believe that Israel does want to do that, needs to do that, and should stand and proudly say that it does that within the constraints of human rights, because this is indeed the reason for having this particular state in that particular location. The state of Israel was founded because Jews didn't have a place in the world in which they were a majority and was to them and to others the nation state of Jews. This is what Israel came to fulfill. I don't see any justification in the name of democracy or anything, or equality or cosmopolitanism or whatever, of demanding that Israel decides that this is over. It's not necessary anymore. We don't want to have that. So my sense of the legitimate goals of Israel do include the continued maintenance of a Jewish majority within the constraints of human rights. And as far as I'm concerned, if a person challenges my right to do that as part of Israel, I will have a political argument with them, and I really hope that they do not become a majority in Israel, because I will think this is very dangerous to Israel. So on this I wanted to make myself clear. I don't know how you stand on that, on the Jewish majority and policy to maintain it, but I wanted to make my point clear.
We have another question, please.
Despite all the differences, it seems to me, listening to highly significant and valid arguments on either side, that there's a great more in common than would seem on the surface. In simple terms, I see it, there's a basic agreement that it's justifiable to describe Israel as a democracy. On the one hand, the view is it's a democracy with, like all democracies, problems. On the other, it's a crippled democracy, inherently incapable of being a first-rate democracy. So I'd like to ask if I may sharpen the distinction by putting a question which I know is difficult to answer, but the question is to both of you. What is the red line, in your view, at which point you would say Israel is no longer a democracy? Apart from, which seems to me you agree, if Israel were to turn its rule over Judea or the West Bank into a de jure permanent thing. Apart from that, which we seem to agree would mean Israel cannot call itself a democracy, what would be the line that breaks the possibility of saying, yes, it's a democracy?
Very simple. For me, Israel is democracy because it's a procedural democracy. So if Israel will end procedural democracy, there will be no elections, no free press, no right to vote and the right to be elected, and imprison people en masse and so. I mean, if Israel will end or weaken procedural democracy, of course, I mean, this will end Israeli democracy. Now, with the West Bank, if they annex the West Bank in one way or another without providing citizenship to the population, then of course it's not a democracy anymore. And now with this vis-a-vis the Arabs in Israel, if they impose, for example, reimpose the military government on Arab areas, or if they use the tactics of transfer of the deportation of the population and so forth, or if they disenfranchise segments, not just individuals here and there, but segments of the Arab population, then Israel will cease to be democracy. I mean, but I don't see that Israel is going this way. I mean, Israel, with all what the right wing is doing, what it does, it de-democratizes Israel, but it's not ending democracy. It's not the same thing. Now, the trend is terrible. That's what you don't understand. It's terrible. Israel has, for 50 years, from the mid-60s, has become more and more democratic. The military government over Arab areas was lifted. The press became no longer owned by political parties as used to be. The Supreme Court became much more powerful. And I can give you many indications. Israel has been, and most of the Israeli Mizrahim and the Zionist religions and the Haredim, which were marginal in Israeli society, moved to the center. I mean, that's what, and they are represented, and you have more power sharing. I mean, there are so many indications. And now, what we have in the last 7 years, the government is a project, it's a project to limit the political activities of the Arabs, the political struggle of the Arabs for more equality. It's limits our right. I mean, every citizen's right to fight against occupation. Yes, that's what they are doing. They do all kinds of activities, all kinds of restrictions. So we cannot fight against occupation. So this
no. That's a mistake. We cannot fight against occupation because of reasons that are totally unrelated. But this is not totally unrelated.
What is the boycott law? What is the boycott law? What's the Nakba law?
Let Ruth agree with you.
Then I come and I become so peaceful that I want to agree with him, and then he says again something that I feel that I must. So let me try. I do think that there is a lot that we agree on, but I think this is something that is common to Israel and to many other places, and related to what we have started with, that it's this low-order democracy. There is a vision of one model of democracy, and this one model of democracy is a liberal democracy that is neutral among the conceptions of the good and neutralizes and privatizes all the non-civic affiliations of its citizens. Everyone is only a citizen and fully and equally a citizen. Now, if this is top democracy, then Israel cannot be top democracy. But I totally reject the idea that this is the only concept of top democracy. I don't think there is any state that functions truly like this. Even the immigration countries that started maybe doing so, obviously are not like that now, Australia and the United States don't come. But definitely most of the European countries are not like that. And when we see what is happening here with the immigration crisis and identity, how can we even say that people just want to be treated as individuals? Now in Israel, the Arab minority doesn't want a state of all its citizens. This is a slogan they use. But they don't want it. They want, and rightly so, They want the right to be considered in dignity and equality as members of a national religious distinct group. They are the native people. I don't want to go into the debate, but this is what they want. They don't want to be just individuals. Most of them, some of them do, but most of them don't. So I think what is happening now is that in Israel, as in all democracies, there is a pendulum move. Now, if one political party sees all the pendulum moves in their direction as following from democracy, then clearly they start protecting and objecting when the pendulum starts moving in the other direction. But you cannot arrest the movement of the pendulum. And in Israel, as in many other countries, the democratization processes that he was talking about, the empowerment of Arabs, of ultra-religious, of people from the periphery, that is precisely what changed the social fabric of Israeli society to make it possible to have different political alliances. I am worried about the nature and the project of Israeli society because I agree that the sectarian forces are getting much stronger and it's dangerous for Israel. But this is what I was saying at the beginning. You said it wasn't sufficiently simple. I want to repeat that because it's critical. I want to fight these tendencies by telling the new elites or the people who want to replace the old elites that A, all societies need elites. B, all societies need non-elective institutions and checks and balances. And it's in our shared interest, not because I'm now the new minority. It is in our shared interest. They, the new groups, they should agree and accept that a strong independent court and good checks and balances between Knesset, Parliament, and the government. All these things are critical for a free society that we all want. So what I'm trying to say is instead of polarizing the right against the left and the new government that is all bad and we that the power of light, we should say, yes, we are together in this. We don't have another state. This is our state. And we together need to work to make it the best it can be for all of us. And sometimes we have conflicts of interest. Of course, it's natural, but democracy will help us deal with them. And we cannot say that any gain by another party is anti-democratic, and all we do and have done is democratic. We should leave democracy out of the political struggle. The political struggle should be very fierce. But democracy is our shared asset. It shouldn't be used as the invocation of values that is delegitimating one part of the population.
I think before we embark on another long discussion and possibly another argument, I think we've reached between our speakers a degree of agreement here. That we've got functional democracy, we've got a democracy with content, and we can argue about the content. I'm not going to try and sum up any of this. It would be entirely beyond me, and I'd just like you all to thank our speakers for a very, very illuminating